This is Retrospective Facilitation, a podcast for facilitators that want to make their retrospectives even more effective. Listen to industry experts, authors, and executives that advocate powerful retros share their stories and insights on how to reflect, adjust, and become more effective. To receive updates on the latest episodes, subscribe to our newsletter at thisisretrospectivefacilitation.com and win a chance to ask questions to our guests. Have you ever wondered why we need a retrospective book? In this episode, we will chat with Patrick Kua. Patrick is a consultant from ThoughtWorks, and he wrote a book about retrospective facilitation, a book that is a good segue out of Diana and Esther's book. It's focused on the role of the facilitator and some of the challenges that he faced, and it's a really interesting book. I hope you guys have a chance to pick it up. In this episode, we will ask him what was the rationale behind putting another book about retrospectives out there, and also if he would change anything since he wrote that book in 2013, if he would change or add anything onto that book. Pat, thank you so much for taking the time for this interview. Pat, you wrote a book, the Retrospective Handbook, and that was in 2013. Is that correct?
Yep, it was a while ago.
And I guess the first question I have is why did you write another book about retrospectives?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just a little bit.
I love the book. But I feel like sometimes when you meet people, they're like, "Oh, really, retrospectives? And do you really need a book about retrospectives?"
Yeah.
And, I interviewed Diana Larson, and she was saying that when they were writing their book in 2007, people were like, "Really, you need a book about retros? Isn't it just 3 questions?" And I found your book touches on really interesting topics, and I'd like you to share some of that with the audience.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think maybe to understand where the book comes from, it probably helps to understand what I've sort of been doing. I'm kind of lucky in that I fell into Agile software development very early. So I've been doing sort of Agile software development since I started working, almost since I started working. And I joined my first team, I think it was probably about 2000 and, I don't know, 3, 4, quite a while ago, where we started doing retrospectives. And, I think for people when they start out and doing retrospectives, I think they're probably that same example of why do you even need a book like this? But I think like everything, there's interesting skills to master. And after you do retrospectives for a while, I think a lot of people being part of a retrospective, you feel this the same way, right? Which is it's getting a bit boring. How do you keep it exciting? If you end up rotating the facilitator role, it's how do you make it more interesting and vary it up, but still keep the same sort of idea to it? And I think for me, I was working as a consultant at the time, and I moved across to different teams and different organizations. And that's where I got to see a real contrast, particularly about, depending on the facilitator, how effective or how ineffective it was. And actually, I still remember a really significant event when I joined a client, and it was back then you had project managers everywhere. And I had a very strong-willed project manager trying to run a retrospective for a client, or he was part of the client. And I was like, wow, this is one of the worst retrospectives I've ever been of. I don't want to take part. I don't know how safe anyone else is feeling, but somebody needs to help people like this understand
how come was the worst retrospective?
So if you can imagine sitting in a room and everyone is facing towards this one person, as if it was a classroom, and then literally you would get a finger pointed at you, and they would say, "Enrico, tell me one thing that went well," right? It's whoa, okay, this is, and then we'd have to wait until he wrote things down onto the whiteboard. It was just very controlled, and, there wasn't the atmosphere. It was that everyone could take part. And for me, there was the same thing about all types of practices, the same thing about things Scrum by the book, is that you can do these activities, but if you forget about the spirit behind them, and if you don't know how to execute them well, you miss the value from that. And I think that's the same thing that, facilitation, I think, takes expertise and skills, and there's whole organizations and communities built around facilitation. And so, I was lucky enough to join one of the retrospective facilitators gathering very early on my path of learning more about retrospectives. And I really appreciated the value and the diversity of approaches of how people could do these effectively. And, having seen a lot of people start down the path of trying out with retrospectives, I was kind of like, oh, there's lots of interesting things that I've experimented with that I've learned from other people that I could share. And that's kind of the birth of the Retrospective Handbook, right? To sort of give people who've been doing retrospectives a while answers to common problems they have, but they don't know maybe who to go to or how to get them answered. So that's
Awesome.
kind of the origins of the book.
Yeah, it's really great. I like that it's focused on the role of the facilitator. One thing that I like as well, you have a chapter about preparation.
Yes.
And how important it is. And I feel oftentimes like you kind of like, I've been in retrospectives where the facilitator is just like Googling like sailboat and is drawing a sailboat on the board and trying to explain it to the group, and no one really understands what's going on.
Yes.
And there's this misconception about retrospective activities. Oh, you just go on Retromat, you create a random retro, and that's your retro.
Yes.
Versus what I've been doing, what other people out there have been doing, which is one of the reasons I started this podcast, is like, okay, let's spend like half an hour before our weekly hour and a half or whatever, and just prepare. And can you tell us a little bit about the spirit of that chapter and what your approach is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, retrospectives are, when they're done well, are like an effective meeting done really well. And when I was learning about, running meetings in general, one of the key steps is really about the preparation. And I think people don't realize that retrospective, like even a daily stand-up or, a planning session, to make the most of the time of the people in that meeting, you as a facilitator wants to create the right space so that they can all take part as best as they can. And, it's a waste of, I think, people's time when the person who's organizing the meeting is sort of starting to set up the meeting while people are there. And that's kind of the essence. It's really a time-saving thing. It's the idea of like multiplying the effectiveness of people. And I think that's the big difference, is it's really to help people who are thinking about how to make a retrospective really effective, what they can do before they get into the room to really think about how to make the most of people's time. And so when I sort of do trainings and help people understand how to prepare for this, there's things like, okay, what is the exercises that you're planning on running? What's the flow and how do these things kind of connect together? What are the materials that you need to make that exercise ready, right? So I've been in some retrospectives where it's like during it, the people are going, oh, does anyone have sticky notes? Does anyone have markers? And of course, you lose a lot of the time as people are collecting material. People lose interest because some people have gone to get stuff. You're waiting for other people to come back. And it's frankly a lot of waste of time. And it's not an effective retrospective. And, I've sat in other retrospectives where like everything is set up for everyone to arrive. The facilitator can start very well by really setting the scene and opening up the space, creating a place for people to start reflecting and to tap into the sort of insights. And that takes time to build up. And so that's kind of some of the elements I think that I was really trying to get in that chapter of really what are the things that you need to do before you get there. So things like, is the right meeting room space, right? So, or are you running a retrospective in the open which might affect people's safety of wanting to discuss topics? Have you thought about the exercises and the equipment then you need as part of the materials? So maybe you need some pre-printed out posters or something ready to sort of put up there. But it's really the facilitator's role to make sure that all of that is done so that people can focus on the conversation the most and not be distracted.
Awesome.
I
like when we prepare to kind of use that time to do like conversations. I think you mentioned that in the book, like having one-on-one with the team, kind of like gauging a little bit of what you're getting into, versus sometimes you're going cold, you don't really have context, which I mean it can be as an emergency kind of situation. But so I like the idea of like us being able to do that step. But I guess one thing that sometimes strikes me is how people are are kind of like focused on the three questions, like what went well, what didn't go so well, what can we change. And I think you
Yes.
mentioned that in the book as well. There is more to that. It's not just about a generic whack-a-mole where we try and fix everything, but
Yes.
rather something else. What is your experience in that, and can you share some insight with the
Yeah.
audience?
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think at the essence of it, there are those three core questions. Particularly when you start to introduce the retrospective practice, I think one of the things that it's useful to do is actually to create a very positive atmosphere, right? Because I think for me, retrospective is really a tool of autonomy that you're giving a team the opportunity to shape the way that they would like to work, to take action and empower people. And I think that's kind of one of the first purposes that I like with introducing retrospectives is that, as a group, people can discuss things, but actually when they take actions away or when they think about changes, it's actually the things that they themselves should do, right? So I think it's a little bit of a smell if a retrospective is starting to generate work for other people and only work for other people. Because I think for me, it's really about creating that environment of empowerment. And in order to do that, for some groups who are facilitated, sometimes it's about helping people as part of that journey realize they have the ability to do things themselves that actually change the situation that might mean things are much more effectively. I've done some sort of end of project retrospectives as well. And I think those things are actually really nice to make sure that you also celebrate things, because I think sometimes in the haste of getting stuff done, people don't celebrate and recognize things that have happened. Perhaps for less successful projects or times, perhaps it's also useful as a process of mourning, right? So of like sort of coming to closure and letting people discuss topics that they felt never really got to address. It's sometimes a bit treacherous to go in that direction because it can become a little bit maybe too much therapy, which I don't think is the purpose of retrospectives. But I think to a certain degree of actually bringing closure can actually be quite useful. I heard of one retrospective where I think some people constructed a house metaphor of the project that they were working on. And because it wasn't such a great thing, they actually set it on fire as a way to close off the entire thing. I thought that was such an interesting kind of
Nice.
metaphor and exercise. But yeah, I think the retrospective goes beyond the three questions, and I think it will depend on the group. If it's a new practice, if it's an existing practice, sometimes, and I really think it's very important to change up the exercises, because I think different questions ask people to look at things from a different perspective. And that's what I really love about it.
Nice. Yeah. And another thing that I was trying to kind of get out there with the podcast is like there's a lot of focus on retrospective activities, as in like, oh, there's sailboat, there's frame, there's a timeline, oh, there's a timeline retrospective. It's a
Yes.
sailboat retrospective. It's a Mad
Yes.
Side Glad retrospective. That's the retrospective versus
Yes.
frameworks like the 5 steps from Dana and Esther, and I think they mention Ored. They mention other bits and pieces that
Yep.
also the book from Sam Kainer that I think you mentioned in your book. So maybe like that part to me is the foundation on
Yes.
top of which we put activities.
Yes.
Do you want to like share your thoughts and some?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a natural process of learning. So I think when people start learning, they follow the rules, right? They do what everyone else does, and that's quite natural. Of saying, okay, well, part of facilitating retrospectives means picking an activity, so I go out and look for activities. I think as you get better as a facilitator, as you develop skills, you realize the tools or the activities that you choose are really just a vehicle for the conversation. And I think that's the greatness of the sort of 5 steps of like Diana and Esther's kind of retrospective outline of really that's helping you navigate the group conversation to get to a result by making sure that people are moving at the same pace. And then the different activities are there to really help you at different points. And I think this is the question that I always ask new facilitators to think about is, why do you pick this activity? What perspective do you hope to get differently with this thing, or what purpose does it serve as part of the overall retrospective?
Yeah, totally. One thing I liked, I think I learned it only about last year, was about the single loop learning, double loop learning, and the
Yes.
diamond of participatory decision making by Sam
Yes.
Kainer. And I think in that sense, I find that once we're focused on something, so once the group have found like some common ground on, hey,
Yes.
this is the thing we want to tackle versus try and
Yes.
whack-a-mole 2 minutes on everything, then we
Yep.
can maybe like pick an activity to diverge
Mm.
and then pick something to let us converge onto some decision points. But yeah, that I feel it's where, regardless of the activity you pick, I felt you get most out of it. And those things are, I think, mentioned in your book, mentioned in Esther's book, but often maybe we lose sight of that. And one other thing I've asked Linda Rising is, how do we change retrospectives? Because as a individual contributor, as an engineer, I was like having struggling on like, okay, well, there's a product manager, there's like a someone else facilitating. What should I do? And I just started doing it, and I just say,
Great.
how about we try this other thing?
Yeah.
And I think for the audience out there is like, just like, even if you're not the Scrum Master, just like try other things. And
Yes.
what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's super healthy. I mean, I think sometimes people get really fixated with this activity is my activity. But I've always worked in teams where, you work in a team because you want to leverage different strengths and skills the best that you can. And I actually think it's healthy to rotate activities because it means that when somebody is away on holidays or if they're sick, things kind of continue going on.
Do you mean facilitator?
Yes, yeah, like a facilitator. But I mean, this is true for all types of activities in general. I think it's good for everyone to share. And I think, like yourself, when you stepped into volunteer to sort of take over or try facilitating, you will have learned some new skills as well, right? Like you'll start to realize actually navigating and sort of facilitating the group conversation as it expands and contracts is like a skill itself that you can also then learn. So I think that role of rotation also offers people new skills to develop. And I think my advice for anyone that's thinking about this and aren't facilitating yet is that I've actually found developing skills as a facilitator have really been really powerful tools to work with as a leader. So I think some of the skills that you develop if you continue down practicing retrospective facilitation are things like, very strong active listening skills, right? You have to be listening for what's not being said sometimes in a retrospective and sort of make sure you maybe ask an interesting question to surface something that people weren't yet maybe comfortable saying immediately or saying between the words. Making sure that people feel listened to and reflecting things back and creating that space, I think are super powerful skills. And yeah, you sort of stepping into the facilitator role means that you get to develop those skills and practice those skills.
Nice. So I think in your book, or actually it was a presentation, you talked about the importance of focusing on principles rather than
Yes.
tools. What do you think is the
Yes.
principle of a retrospective?
So I think there's that's a good question. I don't know if there's one principle, but I
Or
guess for
principles?
me, I guess the principle of a retrospective for me is the principle of continuous improvement, right?
Nice.
So I think if I was to summarize it, for me, that's the vehicle. I think there was a conference once that I was at, I can't remember, it was an XP something conference, and I think somebody said, which practice would you, if you could only choose one practice out of a methodology, what would it be? And I think there was a unanimous kind of feeling from a lot of people, the retrospective would be part of it, because with that, you could then, adapt your process to pick up other practices depending on what your problems or issues were. And so I think the principle of continuous improvement is kind of there. And I think that's why some retrospective flounder is that they spend too much time perhaps on the collecting or issuing of addressing of issues or discussion of issues without then stepping on to the next step of what do we do? Other ones maybe jump too quickly into what do we do without actually discussing what is the common theme, and do we agree we're sort of solving that common topic, right?
Yeah.
So do we have different perspectives?
Yeah, and
But I think,
even being on the same page, I often find maybe it's not happening. So I think you mentioned that in your book when there's like a excessive action and not enough talking, or too much
yes,
talking, not enough action. I don't know which one
yeah,
is more like misleading, but I find in my experience, I find mostly like there's a lot of action happening, but there's not a lot of talking. So people are not really on the same page. We don't dig into the
yes.
deeper problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of them are really issues,
Mm.
but I think that's part of the art of the retrospective. Of sometimes, it's about giving people that space to dive deeper. As you mentioned earlier, rather than spending 2 minutes on everything, you might want to focus for a retrospective on a few key topics that seem to be boiling. And there'll be times in a product or a team where you kind of need to address the elephant in the room that maybe nobody's talking about and spend that time. And then, as things hopefully change, then you can address those other topics. But I think that's kind of like really the spirit of retrospectives, of really that continuous improvement. And also the fact that you can change it again, right? So I think that's the other side, is that I think a lot of people think about changes as permanent. But actually, the point of the retrospective is you get to continue to change it, right? Like, so if something's not working, then maybe go back and try something else, and that's okay.
It's also the point of Agile, maybe. Like nothing's
Yeah,
really. I feel sometimes like Agile is the answer, but really, it's just like I guess the way to get to a answer for today or
exactly.
for this week or for
Yes.
this year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, cool.
Definitely, and it'll change again.
Hmm. Yeah, and just like the way and I think what I like of retrospective is just is a way to look back, a way to kind of like reflect and adjust without blaming. Um,
Yes.
One thing you mentioned in the book is Hofstede's cultural dimensions. I
Yes.
learned it through your book, and I found it really interesting. It's something to be aware as a facilitator. Do you want to like briefly describe that to the audience?
Yeah. Yeah. So Hofstede is a researcher that has developed, I think, a whole organization now that does training around this. And their research was kind of talking about how do nations and the cultures of those nations differ in specific ways. And so in their model, they describe, I think it's 5 different sort of characteristics of different types of cultures. And these are sort of connected to the nations of those cultures. And of course, there are some sort of similarities, but it's quite useful to sort of understand that, the behaviors of people will be often influenced by their upbringing and culture that they have. So one of the cultures that they talk about, so one of the characteristics in the model that they talk about is something called power distance index, or you can kind of think about how formal or informal people treat sort of levels of titles and things like this. So, for instance, in India or Asia, East Asia, you tend to have a lot more of a hierarchical, authoritative style where you don't ever dispute, and this is generalizations, but you don't dispute what a senior perhaps says. Whereas perhaps something in more American style or British, I know this having spent a lot of time there. If you disagree with your manager, you can kind of tell them mostly, right? Like you don't have to worry about saving face. You don't, not so much. I mean, it should still be polite, but disagreeing openly is a lot more accepted. And so it's interesting when you take that into a group conversation, because once again, in today's age of technology where everyone has so many different backgrounds, you have so many different, and maybe teams are doing distributed retrospectives with people across different nations, right? Then you have to think about, are they quiet on the other side of the phone because of the title, or is it that they don't have anything to say, right? Like there's all these different things that you as a facilitator should be aware of, because you need to sort of compensate for that or account for that in the way that you navigate the group conversation. So I really like the model, for building empathy across people, and also it really helps you as a facilitator in your preparation, like we were talking about earlier, to sort of think about what should you be expected to sort of what behaviors would you expect to perhaps see based on the different types of nationalities that you have?
Nice, awesome. Yeah, I really liked his research. I found it relates to I lived in Europe. I'm Italian, but I lived in Australia for 6 years. I've been in the US for
Oh,
six
wow.
years. So it's some
Yes.
of those lessons resonate. And I think you mentioned that that research in the remote retrospective chapter, when you obviously have
Yes.
you're more likely to have people
Yeah,
from different sides of the world. Cool.
exactly.
Cool. So I think we're almost up with our time. I have a another question here in my list. Where is
Okay.
it? I think it was around the like a story for a challenging retrospective that you had. If you want to share with the audience and what you learned from it.
Ooh, it's a good one. So I think one of the challenging retrospectives, and I would say uh, um, it's one of those ones because it doesn't happen so often, right? So I was asked once to run a retrospective for a sort of very large group, and it was probably about sort of 90 people.
By yourself?
Yeah. Yes, by myself. And I
Can you
think what's
clone
interesting
yourself?
there, Uh, I did reel in a few people to help at least run a couple of the different activities from the group itself. But, you know, it was a bit of an unusual one because it wasn't really a sort of formal team thing, but it was a more like an event type of retrospective. And so I think what was kind of fun with that is that, you know, I was lucky that the event was very fun. So you had a lot of engaged people. And it was sort of trying to wrap up how would you rerun the sort of event and get feedback from that sort of perspective. But for me, that was probably I hadn't ever run like a large scale retrospective like this one before. And it was kind of interesting of trying to work out and plan what activities, how to break up the group, how to get groups to sort of report back in, and to balance that thing of diverging, as you said before, and then converging, and then also getting sort of agreement as to sort of next steps and to distill, you know, lots of feedback and lots of information at the same time. So that was a very exciting and sort of challenging retrospective for me personally.
Nice. How long was that? How many hours did you have?
I think we had about 2 hours.
Cool. Yeah, I'll have someone from a consultancy called Agile 42. They wrote a blog post about having a retrospective with a group of like, I think 60 or 70 people. And it's
Oh,
really
great.
interesting. I'll share it on this podcast. They've had like multiple diamond of participatory decision making based
Yes.
on the group. So they broke up three objectives. They had
Uh-huh.
three diamonds. They diverged, converged. But I'll have them on the show so they can share more insights. And they had like I think 3 or 4 facilitators helping out. So I
Wow.
think
Amazing.
you're a superhero.
I was just lucky. I think it went well.
Nice. Cool. So the last 3 questions I asked to all our guests are the following. The first one is, which one is your favorite retrospective activity? And if you have a story about it.
Ooh, so I probably have to say one of my favorites is probably the starfish. So it was one of the first ones that I wrote up on my blog. I can't actually take credit for it. I think I remember somebody that I worked with who'd come back from a conference and they introduced it. And me having a bad memory, I wanted to make sure that I remembered how to run it. So I wrote up a blog post. I think it was back in 2012 or something like this. Anyway, about running the Starfish retrospective, which gets referred to quite a lot. So that's probably my favorite one.
Nice. Actually, I forgot one other question. Is like, was like, you wrote a book in 2013. Is there anything that in the last 5, 6 years, if you wrote the book today, you would have added to the book?
I think one of the sections that I was uh, conscious of trying to put in or not was really about tools, particularly for distributed retrospectives. And I think actually it's come a long way. I mean, Retromat didn't exist either for even cataloging of different activities and things like that. So simply references and things have changed, as have the tools, because particularly in today's age where more people are doing remote working, where teams are really very, very distributed, I think there's a lot more people who've experimented and tried different tools. So that's probably the thing that I would update.
Nice, awesome. And back to the last two questions now. What is a book that you are reading right now?
One of the books that I'm reading at the moment is Joy Inc. And it actually connects very well to Retrospectives. I'm just starting it off, and it's talking about the introduction of XP to an environment where they're working in very waterfallish type environments. And they've just gone on trying a week of extreme programming, including Retrospectives. And it went very well.
Nice.
So
So is it like Project Phoenix kind of thing? Kind of like a story?
No, so Joy Inc., from what I understand, is really about how to build companies who are optimized for joy. So,
Nice.
in today's age, obviously businesses are typically optimized for profit making. But I think more and more you hear a lot more about purpose or mission-driven organizations other than making money. And this is the tale of a person who is well known for apparently building companies where people have joy at work, which is great.
Nice. Awesome. And the final question, Pat, is what is your favorite dish?
What is my favorite dish, as in what I like to eat?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a really hard one. I love food, so all types of food. So it's very hard to sort of guess. But if you had to force me, I think it's not really a dish, but more of an item, is that I'm a big sucker for ice cream. So I'm Australian, and I think after the US, Australians eat the second most amount of ice cream in the world per litre per person, because of both weather and perhaps, a lot of Italian people with gelatos, but I'm a big sucker for ice cream.
Nice.
So,
awesome.
yes.
Pat, thank you so much for taking the time. Anything else that you want to share with the audience before we stop recording?
No, thanks you. Really appreciate the conversation, and thanks for having me.
Cool.
Our guests share lots of insights and ideas. Which change are you going to try in your next retrospective? Tell us on Twitter with hashtag #ThisIsRetrospectiveFacilitation, or leave us a comment on thisisretrospectivefacilitation.com. You can connect with Patrick on Twitter at PatQA. Norm Kurt, known as the father of retrospectives and author of the book Project Retrospectives, suffered a disabling brain injury in a car accident 20 years ago. Visit thisisretrospectivefacilitation.com/helpnorm for details and a link on how to contribute to his fund. Thank you for listening. This is Enrico Teotti. Till next time.